element is how confident are you going to be in the data that you acquired? Well, if you went over all these different aspects we discussed in the pitfall, maybe at the end of the road, the data that you're looking at might be looking like a low flow, low grade NAS, but maybe it could be explained by the way the system processes the information that's presented to them through the transducer. So most systems that are ultrasound based operates under a CPU, a central processing unit, in which the data calculated are done in series, one after another. Now, there is now a new way of processing ultrasound data, and it's done through a GPU, a graphic processing unit, that does the entire data set of process. And all of that is done in parallel. So therefore, you have anywhere between 1,000 and 100,000 times more processing power to be able to measure the velocities of all the data that are presented to you. Now, if the aortic stenosis is mild, or if it's very severe, the flow will be somewhat less turbulent. If you're in the middle, it is possible that some of the turbulent flow on the outside of the jet might actually be partially measured through the CPU as being not as accurate and filtered out through what is usually done as a discrete or a fast Fourier transform in the Doppler elements of the system. Essentially, they're doing a regression toward the mean to present through the CPU calculation a high confidence set of data. By doing so, they're very confident that the data that was presented is at least this. Now, it could be higher, but it's at least this. If you process that Doppler information through the GPU and you have higher processing power, you don't necessarily need to filter out all that higher gradient information, and therefore you can present it with higher confidence to the end user, meaning you. How does that translate into a clinical case? Well, you could be in a situation where visually the EF doesn't look too bad. You're probably anywhere between 45 and 50. And when you measure your stroke volume index, you're not completely normal, but you're not bad either. You're not very low. You might be around 32, 33 ml per meter square. And when you do the calculation of LVOT VTI and aortic VTI, you end up with a valve area of about 1.5 centimeters squared. That's all in the moderate range. But when you look at the valve barely opens. The valve is very calcified by 2D images, and you would expect to see a smaller aortic valve area, and therefore you would expect to see much higher continuous wave measurements of peak velocities and mean velocities across the aortic valve. In a case that I just described, you have peak velocities in the low 3 meters per second and mean gradients in the high 20s. So you're not reaching the severe criteria, although the patients clinically look like he has or she has severe aortic stenosis. And by 2D, it looks like it's severe aortic stenosis. Now, is it possible that if you redo those measurements on a GPU-based processor, you will be able to gather those additional higher velocity on your data gathering system and therefore be able to document the fact that actually this patient does not have moderate aortic stenosis, but is clearly in the aortic stenosis range? To prove the point of here, I have a document from 2011 that presents the throughput in terms of frame per second of ultrasound data point from CPU versus GPU. And you can see that on the GPU side of things, the first graphic bar, you can process the information with about 1,000 times higher. So logarithmically, several times higher processing power, and therefore be able to get a lot more measurements with confidence. Clinically, the case that I just described, when we did the measurements of the velocities across the aortic valve using a CPU-based system, we got barely 3 meters per second. When we did it with a GPU-based processor, we got above 4 meters per second. So clearly matching the clinical information we have, the 2D images we have, with the data point that are now proving that this patient has aortic stenosis. So after you took into consideration all the technical elements of scanning a patient with aortic stenosis, if you end up facing a situation where you're in the moderate range by most criteria, and you think you might have a low flow, low gradient aortic stenosis, but that doesn't match what you're seeing, maybe the answer to that mismatch is the technology gap of the system that you've been using. And it might worth asking yourself, are we using a CPU-based or a GPU-based ultrasound system? Thank you.